From the moment they entered the world, there was something wrong about the sound they made. It was a damp spring morning in 1894 when Alara and Isolde Raines were born in the back room of a leaning clapboard house overlooking the slate-gray sea. The midwife swore later that she had delivered them in silence, for there had been no separate wails, no staggered first breath, only a single cry that seemed to split in two as it filled the air. The voices were identical, pitched perfectly alike, rising and falling in the same rhythm as if carried on a single invisible breath. The sound unsettled everyone present. It was too precise, too rehearsed for newborn lungs. Their mother, pale and exhausted, clutched them both to her chest as if the warmth of her body could drown out the unnatural harmony. Their father, a fisherman with calloused hands, said it was a gift, a sign the girls were bound by something unbreakable. But the midwife kept her eyes low and her lips pressed tight, as though she had heard something she could not name. As weeks turned into months, the peculiarity only deepened. In their wooden cradle by the window, the twins would coo and murmur in tones so identical that anyone listening from the next room could not tell who made the sound. If one stirred in her sleep, the other's breathing would change to match it within seconds. Neighbors who visited out of curiosity often left uneasy, claiming the girls' eyes seemed to follow in the same direction, their heads tilting in unison as if listening to a sound no one else could hear. Some swore they had seen Alara's mouth moving while Isolde made the noise, and vice versa, a strange mirroring that blurred the lines between who was speaking and who was only shadowing. By the time they could sit upright, the twins had developed a habit of turning their heads toward each other before uttering a sound. Their voices would spill out at once, matching syllable for syllable, laughter blending so seamlessly that it was impossible to tell if one was echoing or if both were truly speaking at the same moment. At first, their mother tried to ignore the chill it sent down her spine, insisting it was nothing more than a sisterly bond. But one night, when the wind rattled the shutters and the waves pounded the shore, she swore she heard them babbling to each other from separate corners of the room. Yet every word struck her ears as one continuous stream, as though a single voice were split between two mouths. The village was small and word traveled fast. Old women began crossing themselves when they passed the Rains' home, muttering about twins who speak with one breath. Men at the docks joked uneasily about the kind of children who might lure sailors to their deaths with song. Yet not everyone was afraid. A traveling physician from the city, hearing of the phenomenon, came to see the girls when they were barely 2 years old. He was a sharp-eyed man with a fondness for curiosities, and he spent hours observing them, clapping once to see if both heads turned in the same instant, asking them to repeat words after him. When they did, he grew visibly pale. Their repetition was not the clumsy mimicry of children, but something exact, as if a single mind spoke through two mouths. He left the village with hurried notes, never to return, though others soon came. Strangers with questions, men and women who carried notebooks and gloves speaking of studies and experiments. Their parents refused all offers to take the twins away for observation, but the attention had already marked them. Even at such a young age, the girls seemed aware of the effect they had on people. Isolde, in particular, would watch visitors with an unblinking calm, her gaze steady until they shifted uncomfortably and looked away. Ilara, by contrast, would fidget, glance at the floor, and yet somehow her voice, their voice, would remain steady and perfectly matched to her sister's tone. It was as though she could not escape it even if she wanted to. To the outside world, they were only an oddity, a strange whisper of something beyond normal understanding. But inside the Rains household, small things began to change. Toys were no longer shared, but arranged in mirrored patterns, each girl sitting before her own set, yet handling them in precise synchronization. Meals were eaten bite for bite, chew for chew. If one coughed, the other's throat would convulse a moment later. At night, their mother would find them sleeping in the same position, hands folded in the same way, their breaths rising and falling together like a single tide. It was a kind of unity that felt less like closeness and more like a cage. In the dim glow of the oil lamp, when the house was quiet and the sea winds moaned through the cracks in the wood, there were moments when even their parents could not tell which child had spoken. Sometimes they were certain only one mouth had moved, yet the sound had come from both. It was in these moments, these tiny slivers of the unnatural, that the first shadow of dread began to settle in the hearts of those who lived under the same roof. They did not yet know what the voice would cost them. But the air in that little house by the shore was already heavy with a sense that the twins had not come into the world to share a voice. One of them would eventually take it. By the time the twins reached their 7th year, their shared voice had shifted from a curious village tale into something more unsettling, something people avoided mentioning aloud. At first glance, Ilara and Isolde were simply two thin, pale girls in matching wool dresses, hair tied back neatly with their mother's ribbons. Yet there was a tension between them that no clothing or manners could soften. It was in the way Ilara's shoulders hunched when Isolde's gaze fixed on her, in the way her hands would twitch toward her lap whenever her sister stood too close. Their voices, still perfectly aligned, had gained a new quality. When Ilara laughed at some childish jest, the sound was sweet and warm, but beside her, Isolde's mouth would curve into the same smile without the faintest spark in her eyes, producing the same laugh stripped of all joy, a hollow mirror of the original. Those who saw it would later admit that the imitation felt like a theft, as though Isolde were peeling away the sound from her sister and wearing it for herself. At night, their mother sometimes crept into their room to check on them, only to freeze in the doorway. Ilara would be sleeping, mouth slack in the looseness of dreams, yet Isolde's lips would move faintly in the dark, shaping the words of her sister's whispered dreams. Once their mother swore she heard the two of them carrying on a soft, steady conversation even though only one set of eyes was open. The sound was eerie, no pauses, no moments of confusion. A single stream of speech flowing between two bodies. Their father brushed off her unease, calling it nothing more than the closeness of twins, but she knew closeness did not explain the way Ilara's breathing sometimes hitched in time with Isolde's words, as if her lungs were not her own. Around the village, differences between the two became clearer. Ilara was timid, quick to flinch when addressed, her words quiet and less coaxed. She moved as though mindful of taking up too much space, the kind of child who would apologize for stepping into a shadow. Isolde, however, was different. She was still and watchful, her expression rarely changing, her dark eyes following people with the patience of someone studying a specimen. She did not interrupt, did not chatter, but she absorbed everything. The tremble in a fisherman's hand as he lit his pipe, the nervous glance of a school teacher fumbling over a lesson. There was a precision in her that was unnatural for a child, as though she kept her thoughts stored neatly in some locked cabinet no one else could open. Rumors began to circulate quietly. A neighbor claimed she had seen Isolde instructing Alara to stand barefoot on a frost-covered path for nearly an hour, whispering something into her ear the entire time. Another insisted the twins had been found behind the church, crouched over a dead crow with its beak pried open and tiny stones shoved inside. When questioned, Ilara's eyes would fill with tears, but she would say nothing. Isolde would simply watch, her face smooth, her voice steady as she explained that they had only been playing. Their parents denied every story, insisting their daughters were simply imaginative. Yet there was a brittle edge to their denials, as though they feared confirming what they already suspected. In the rare moments Alara spoke alone, her voice seemed thinner, as if drained of its fullness. But when Isolde joined in, the harmony returned, stronger than ever. Some villagers noticed that Ilara's independent words grew fewer with each passing month, as though she was learning that her voice only truly existed when paired with her sister's. It was during these months that a quiet malice seemed to bloom in Isolde, not an outburst, not cruelty in the ways most would recognize, but a slow, deliberate shaping of the world around her. She chose where they sat, what games they played, when they would leave or stay. And if Ilara hesitated, Isolde's gaze would rest on her until she obeyed. By the first frost of that year, the air between them had changed entirely. Ilara's laugh no longer came unbidden. It seemed to wait for permission. Isolde's shadow fell over every word she spoke, every step she took. The twins still shared that uncanny, perfect voice, but now it felt like a chain binding them together, one link tightening each day. And though no one could prove it, there were whispers that Isolde did not simply share her sister's voice. She was beginning to take it piece by piece in a quiet theft no one knew how to stop. The spring of 1901 arrived with the slow thaw of ice along the tidal flats and the return of fishermen to the sea. But for the Rains family, it brought a tension no season could wash away. Ilara and Isolde were now 10 years old, their identical features sharpened with age, their shared voice no less uncanny but more carefully used. They spoke less in public, aware of the stares it drew, but in private their conversations still spilled forth in perfect unison, one starting where the other ended without a single pause. To their parents this was simply habit, though their mother sometimes caught Ilara lingering at the edge of the room, staring at her sister with an expression that was not fear exactly, but something quieter, the look of a person waiting for a moment they knew would come. It was during these months that the twins grew close to a boy from the village, Peter Whitlock. He was 11, the son of a dock worker, quick to smile and generous with the small trinkets he found washed up along the shore. Ilara seemed to like him. She would sit on a rock by the water and listen to him speak, her eyes bright in a way they rarely were. Isolde, however, watched him differently, her gaze steady and measuring as though she were listening not to what he said, but to the way his voice carried through the salt air. She began asking questions about his family, his health, how often he lost his voice in the cold months. Peter laughed off her curiosity, thinking it nothing more than childish interest. One overcast afternoon, Peter was last seen walking along the path home from school with the twins. The three were talking quietly, though villagers later said it looked more like Peter speaking to Ilara, while Isolde trailed just a step behind, her eyes fixed on his throat as he spoke. That night, Peter did not return home. The search began the next morning, with men combing the shore and the marshes, calling his name until their voices were hoarse. For 3 days, there was no sign of him. On the 4th, his body was found at the edge of the tidal flats, where the sand turned to black silt. His skin was cold and waxy, but what struck everyone first was the wound. His chest had been opened with an unnatural precision, no ragged tearing as from an animal or crude tool. Inside, something vital was missing. His vocal cords gone entirely. The coroner, unused to such sights, noted in hushed tones that the removal had been clean, almost surgical, the surrounding tissue untouched. In the cavity where his voice should have lived, someone had placed a braided cord, thin, pale, and slick, woven from strands that looked disturbingly like hair and sinew. It was tied neatly in a loop as though meant to be worn. No one in the village could explain it. The fishermen muttered about rituals, about curses brought in from the sea. The minister spoke of the devil's work. But in the Rains household, the subject was met with silence. Ilara stopped speaking for a full week after Peter's body was found. When she did make a sound, it was hesitant, like a voice trying to find its place again. Isolde, on the other hand, seemed unaffected. Each night, as the family sat in the dim kitchen, she would hum a low, steady tune, an old lullaby the girls had known since infancy. Her humming had always matched Ilara's pitch exactly, but now there was something else within it, an extra note hidden under the familiar melody. It was as though another voice had joined her, faint but present, like an echo in a distant room. No one dared accuse the twins of knowing more than they admitted, yet the unease in the village deepened. Parents began calling their children inside before dusk, and conversations in the marketplace broke off when the girls passed by. The mystery of Peter Whitlock's death remained unsolved in any official sense, but among the older residents there was no doubt that something unnatural had taken root in their midst. And though no one could see the connection, the sound of Isolde's humming carried faintly over the water each night, drifting toward the tidal flats where the tide swallowed the shore. The same place where a boy's voice had been taken, and something else left in its place. The discovery came in the pale hours before dawn, when the house was cold and quiet enough that even the creak of the floorboards seemed loud. Ilara's mother had risen early, unable to sleep after another night of hearing the twins' faint matching murmurs through the thin walls. She had gone to their room with the simple intention of checking on them, of pulling the blanket higher over their small shoulders, but something in the air stopped her at the doorway. The twins lay still, both on their backs, faces turned toward each other, mouths slightly parted. The lamp on the bedside table was unlit, yet the smell in the room was strange. A faint, briny tang, as though sea air had somehow seeped in during the night. Her eyes drifted downward and caught the uneven hem of the bedsheet where it brushed the wooden floor. Beneath the bed, half hidden by dust and shadow, something glass caught the faint glint of early light. She crouched, her joints stiff with the chill, and reached for it. Her fingertips brushed the cold, smooth surface of a jar, its top sealed with a thick plug of dark wax. It was small enough to hold in one hand, but heavy, and as she lifted it into the dim light, the contents swam into view. Inside the cloudy liquid was something pale and soft, curling slightly as it floated. Strands of wet tissue that seemed to have once been part of something alive. At first she thought it was some strange jellyfish, but then she saw the shape more clearly. It was a cluster of vocal cords, the delicate bands shriveled but still whole, their edges threaded with fine hairs as though they had been wound into place. Her hand trembled and the jar knocked softly against the wood, sending ripples through the brine. The room was still except for the faint rhythm of breathing from the bed. Then in the doorway behind her came the slow, deliberate sound of bare feet on the floor. She turned her head, heart hammering, and saw Isolde standing there in her nightdress, her face unreadable in the half-light. The child's eyes moved from her mother's hands to the jar, then to her mother's face. There was no alarm, no attempt to hide what had been found. Instead, Isolde simply stood there, lips closed, her stillness so complete it felt like a warning. From the other bed, Ilara stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, and the moment she saw the jar in her mother's grip, she sat up, her face draining of color. The expression she gave was not one of guilt, but of something close to terror, though whether it was fear of the object or fear of her sister, her mother could not tell. The silence stretched on, and then, without speaking, Isolde walked across the room, took the jar from her mother's hand with a small, sure movement, and set it back under the bed. She returned to her own side without a word, climbing beneath the blanket as if nothing had happened. The mother's breath came shallowly. She wanted to demand an explanation, to shake the truth out of both of them, but the look on Isolde's face, calm, almost bored, rooted her to the spot. There was something in it that told her no answer would be given, and perhaps more disturbingly, that no answer would be safe to hear. She left the room without touching them again, closing the door behind her with care, and for the rest of the morning she spoke to no one. That night she poured herself whiskey in the kitchen long after the rest of the family had gone to bed. She sat with the lamp burning low, staring into the shadows on the wall and listening for the faint sounds from upstairs. At first there was only silence, then came the soft, overlapping hum of the twins' voices. They weren't speaking words, just a sound, low and steady like a single note held between two throats. It reminded her of the jar's contents, of the pale tissue swaying in cloudy liquid, and she wondered how many such jars might be hidden in her house. The whiskey burned her throat, but the warmth could not touch the cold now lodged behind her ribs. She never told her husband what she had found. In the days that followed, she avoided being alone in the twins' room. The jar remained where Isolde had placed it, unseen but never forgotten, its presence a quiet weight beneath the floorboards. And though the house was the same, something in her had shifted. She began to drink more often, not in celebration or company, but in the lonely hours between dusk and dawn, as though the burn in her chest was the only thing strong enough to drown the sound of two voices speaking as one in the darkness above. The wind off the coast was sharp that night, cutting through the gaps in the rocks and carrying the smell of brine far inland. The tide was receding, revealing jagged pools along the shoreline where tiny creatures writhed in the moonlight. Isolde had chosen this night, and Ilara had followed without protest, her boots sinking into the wet sand with every reluctant step. Their mother slept heavily in the house, her breath sour with drink, and their father was still mending nets in the boathouse. No one had seen the girls slip away, and no one would think to look for them until morning. In Isolde's hands was a bundle wrapped in cloth small enough to be hidden beneath her coat. When they reached a narrow inlet between two high rocks, she knelt and unwrapped it. Inside was a stray kitten, its fur matted, its thin body trembling with fear. Its eyes darted in the dim light, and when it opened its mouth to cry, Ilara's throat tightened reflexively as though she could feel the sound pulling at her own voice. Isolde's face remained calm, the moon casting her features in pale relief. She produced a length of twine from her pocket, looping it with quick, practiced movements around the kitten's small legs, binding them together. Ilara watched, her lips parting to speak, but no words came. Isolde carried the bound animal to a wooden stake lodged in the sand near the tide's edge, an old marker once used by fishermen to measure the water's reach. Without hesitation, she tied the twine to the stake, ensuring the kitten could not run. The creature writhed, letting out high-pitched cries that echoed strangely against the rocks. Each sound made Ilara flinch, yet she stood frozen, her boots sinking deeper into the wet sand. Isolde turned to her sister, and in that shared voice they had always carried, began to chant. The words were not familiar. A strange, low rhythm that seemed to have no beginning or end. Ilara's mouth moved without her will, forming the same syllables in perfect time with Isolde's. The sound wrapped around them, merging with the hiss of the tide as the water crept back toward shore. The kitten's cries grew sharper, and each one was met with a subtle change in the chant, as if Isolde were weaving the sounds into something only she could understand. The water began to lap at the kitten's fur. Its body jerked violently against the bindings, but the tide was relentless. Ilara could feel the damp chill seeping into her own legs, her lungs tightening as though she were drowning alongside it. Her voice, or perhaps Isolde's, did not falter. The chant continued, steady and unbroken, until the animal's cries became muffled gurgles and then fell silent altogether. When the water finally receded again, the kitten lay limp, its small body bobbing slightly against the twine. Isolde approached it without hesitation, her fingers brushing its head as though offering comfort far too late to matter. She untied the cord, lifting the sodden body from the stake and wrapping it once more in the cloth. The silence now was absolute, broken only by the faint sound of their breathing. In perfect sync, as always. They made their way back toward the village, the moonlight catching on the water that clung to their boots. Ilara's face was pale, her eyes fixed on the bundle in her sister's arms, but she said nothing. Isolde walked as if carrying nothing more than an ordinary parcel, her gaze fixed ahead, expression unchanged. By the time they reached the edge of the path leading to their home, the sound of waves had faded, replaced by the creak of timbers in the wind. The next morning, several villagers swore they had heard something strange during the night. Two voices, high and pure, carrying across the water in eerie harmony. Some said it was singing, others that it was a curse. No one traced it to the Rain sisters, though more than one fisherman made the sign of the cross when they saw the girls later that day. Ilara kept her eyes down, but Isolde's gaze swept over the harbor with the same quiet calculation it always did, as though she were measuring something invisible, something only she understood. The kitten was never seen again. The cloth that had wrapped it was burned in the fireplace the following evening, its faint smell of salt and decay clinging to the air long after the flames died. And in the nights that followed, when the tide was high and the moon was full, some claimed they could still hear two voices out on the rocks, speaking in perfect unison to the restless sea. By summer, the shoreline had become a place of whispered warnings. Parents told their children not to wander too close to the water after dusk, though few explained why. The official word was that it was the tide, dangerous and unpredictable. But those who had lived in the village long enough spoke of other dangers in hushed tones, of something that watched from the rocks and waited. That year, 3 more children vanished, each disappearance unfolding in much the same way. Seen playing near the beach, seen speaking with someone just out of sight, then gone without a trace until the sea gave them back. When the bodies were found, they bore the same marks that had taken Peter Whitlock. The cuts were impossibly clean, each child's throat opened with a precision no fisherman's blade could match. Their vocal cords were missing, the surrounding flesh untouched, replaced with an object that seemed chosen with deliberate meaning. One had a twisted fish bone curled like a question mark in the hollow where the voice should have been. Another had a ring woven from grass and seaweed, its knots tight as if meant to bind something forever. The third carried a scrap of blue fabric, hand-stitched with 2 small, perfect circles. The coroner could find no explanation that made sense, and the constable muttered only that someone with skill and with a purpose had done it. In the Rains house, the air grew heavier by the day. Ilara spoke less and less, and when she did, her voice was thinner, more strained, as though each word cost her something she could not afford to lose. At night, her sleep was restless, her breathing shallow, and her hands sometimes rose to her throat as if to guard it. Isolde remained the same, still patient and unnervingly alert. She had taken to keeping a small wooden chest in the corner of their room, its surface worn but its lock always fastened. Ilara avoided looking at it, yet she seemed unable to keep her eyes from drifting toward it when she thought no one was watching. One evening, while their parents were away, Ilara worked up the courage to try. She waited until Isolde was downstairs, her footsteps slow and deliberate on the creaking boards, then approached the chest. The lock was old, and with a trembling hand, she slid a hairpin into it. The click was soft, but it echoed in her ears like a warning bell. She lifted the lid and froze. Inside, wrapped in strips of oiled cloth, were small glass jars, each filled with cloudy liquid. In each jar floated a pale, shriveled mass, vocal cords, some tiny and delicate, others larger but all perfectly intact. Each jar carried a label written in careful hand, initials, dates, sometimes a single word. She barely had time to take in the sight before a shadow fell across her. Isolde stood in the doorway, her expression unchanged, but there was something sharper in her stillness, a tension like the moment before a trap springs shut. Ilara's mouth opened, but before she could speak, Isolde crossed the room in 2 slow steps, her eyes fixed not on her sister's face, but on her throat. With quiet precision, she closed the chest and turned the key in the lock, slipping it into her pocket. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. That night, Ilara lay awake long after the lamp was extinguished. The image of those jars burned into her mind. She knew now, without question, that the objects placed inside the children's bodies had not been chosen at random. Each was a marker, a piece of some private ritual only Isolde understood. And in that ritual, the voice itself, the living sound of it, was the prize. By the time the next child vanished, the village no longer spoke openly of accidents or bad luck. The old women at the market clutched their charms tighter when the twins passed, and fishermen turned away without greeting them. Yet no one dared confront the Rains family directly. There was no proof, nothing a constable could write down, and those who thought too much about the missing voices seemed to lose their own words before they could speak them aloud. And so the tide kept rolling in. The gulls kept circling overhead, and somewhere in the dim corner of a locked chest, the harvest of breath grew quietly, jar by jar. By autumn of that year, Ilara's decline was no longer something she could hide. Her skin had taken on a wan, translucent quality, her cheeks hollowing as if the color had been leached from her. She moved slowly, her steps unsteady, and sometimes her knees buckled without warning. Meals went untouched, not from stubbornness, but from some deeper exhaustion, as if even lifting a spoon demanded more strength than she had. What frightened her mother most was not the pallor or the weight loss, but the way Ilara seemed to pause mid-sentence, her lips still moving but no sound emerging, as though the words had been caught somewhere inside her and could not be freed. The midwife, summoned in a hushed panic, examined Ilara and frowned at what she found. Her pulse was irregular, not in the erratic way of illness, but in a rhythm that unnervingly matched her sister's breathing. She noted it aloud, half to herself, that when Isolde inhaled, Ilara's heartbeat seemed to quicken, and when Isolde exhaled, it slowed again. The midwife left the house looking pale and muttered that she would return with remedies, though her voice trembled when she promised it. Isolde herself seemed untouched by whatever plagued her sister. She moved through the house with the same measured pace, her eyes calm, her face an unchanging mask. But there were moments, small and fleeting, when her gaze would drift to Ilara's throat, and her lips would part slightly as though tasting the air. The shared voice had not faded. In fact, it had grown stronger in its unison. When Ilara's words faltered, Isolde would step in, speaking in perfect match to what her sister had meant to say. So seamless it was, as if the hesitation had never existed. The effect was jarring, and it left the listener feeling they had witnessed something unnatural, as if the voice had been lifted from one mouth and placed into another. One evening, Ilara collapsed at the dinner table, her body going limp before her spoon clattered to the floor. Her mother cried out and rushed to her side, shaking her lightly until her eyes fluttered open. Ilara whispered that she felt pulled, her hands clutching at her throat as though something inside was being drawn upward, stretched taut. Her father, unsettled by the sight, looked to Isolde for some reaction, but she merely watched, her fingers tapping softly against the table in a steady rhythm. The days that followed blurred together. Ilara spent most of her time in bed, her voice reduced to a whisper so faint her mother sometimes leaned so close their foreheads touched just to catch the sound. The few times she spoke without Isolde present, her words came haltingly, missing the fluidity they once had. But when her sister entered the room, something would change. Their voices, when used together, were as steady and perfectly aligned as they had been in childhood. It was as though whatever illness drained Ilara gave strength to the connection between them. The villagers noticed the change as well. Some claimed they saw Ilara moving her lips without sound while Isolde spoke aloud, her voice richer and sharper than before. A fisherman swore that as he passed their house one night, he heard both girls speaking at once in tones so perfectly matched that it made his skin crawl. Yet when he looked through the window, only Isolde's mouth was moving. Her mother tried to keep Ilara away from her sister, arranging for her to rest in the downstairs room while Isolde remained upstairs. But it never lasted. Within hours, the two would find each other, drawn together by some invisible pull. The longer they were apart, the more agitated they became, and when reunited, they would sit side by side in total stillness, their breathing sinking within moments. One cold night, a storm rattled the shutters and sent the smell of salt through the air. Ilara woke gasping, clutching her throat, and her mother rushed to her side. As she leaned close, she froze. The sound coming from Ilara's mouth was not her daughter's voice. It was lower, colder, and unmistakably Isolde's. Upstairs in the dark, Isolde lay in her bed with her eyes closed, her lips unmoving, but her chest rising and falling as though she were speaking all the same. By morning, Ilara's breathing had steadied, but her voice was weaker than ever, barely more than a rasp. Isolde, by contrast, seemed refreshed, her tone carrying an unusual strength, resonating in a way that made the hair on the back of the neck stand on end. The balance between them had shifted, and though no one spoke the truth aloud, it was clear to those who lived under that roof. Isolde was taking something from her sister. The question was no longer whether she could stop, but whether she would ever choose to. The winter of 1906 settled over the village like a shroud, the air thick with salt and frost. The sea locked in a gray stillness that seemed to stretch for weeks. Inside the Rains house, the fire burned low most nights, the woodpile dwindling, and a tension far colder than the air hung over the family. Ilara was little more than a shadow by then, her frame fragile beneath the quilt, her breath shallow and uneven. Her skin was so pale it seemed to catch the lamplight in a way that made her look translucent, almost spectral. She had stopped trying to speak unless directly addressed, and even then her words came out in a rasp that seemed to bruise the air. Isolde, however, was untouched by the season's cruelty. Her cheeks carried a faint flush, her eyes remained sharp and watchful. If anything, she seemed stronger, her posture straighter, her steps more certain. When she spoke, her voice filled the room, resonant in a way that made people turn their heads. It was no longer just her voice. At times it slipped seamlessly into the tone that had once belonged to Ilara. Hearing it was like catching the scent of something familiar in a place it shouldn't be, stirring both recognition and dread. On the night it happened, the snow was falling in soft, soundless drifts. Their mother had retired early, drained from weeks of tending to Ilara's fevers and sudden fainting spells. Their father was away on the night tide, hoping for a rare winter catch. The twins were alone in their upstairs room, the fire in the grate reduced to embers. Ilara lay curled under the quilt, eyes closed, her breath coming in uneven pulls. Isolde sat beside her, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. The house was silent but for the faint crackle of the dying fire. At some point in the night, Ilara's breathing changed. It became slower, shallower, until each inhale was separated by long, uneasy pauses. Isolde leaned closer, her face calm, her expression unreadable. She spoke in a low tone, words that carried no meaning to anyone but herself. Ilara's lips began to move in time with the sound, though no voice emerged. The rhythm between them was perfect. Each breath, each flicker of movement in sync, as though they were bound by something far older than their years. When the final breath left Ilara, it was quiet, almost imperceptible. There was no struggle, no cry. Her body simply stilled. Isolde did not move for several minutes, her gaze fixed on her sister's face. Then slowly she inhaled, and as she did, her voice filled the room. Not her own this time, but Ilara's. It was perfect, clear, and steady, carrying none of the weakness that had plagued it for months. She spoke a single sentence into the empty air. The sound so true to Ilara's tone that it was as though the dead girl had risen and spoken through her. Their mother found them at dawn. The snow outside had stopped and the first light of day fell across the bed. Ilara lay still, her eyes closed, her mouth frozen in a silent scream that no one had heard. Isolde sat beside her, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze turned toward the window. When asked what had happened, she answered in that shared voice. The harmony perfect and unbroken, though one half of it now belonged to the dead. The funeral was held 2 days later in the small church on the hill. Villagers gathered in the bitter cold, their breath rising in white clouds as the coffin was lowered into the frozen earth. Isolde stood at the grave, her black dress unwrinkled despite the wind, her hair pinned back neatly. As the first shovelful of dirt struck the lid, she began to speak. It was not her own voice that carried over the mourners, but Ilara's. Bright, alive, and unshaken by the grave. A murmur rippled through the crowd, some stepping back in fear, others crossing themselves quickly. The sound was unnatural in its perfection, as if death had not stolen the voice but merely transferred it into the living. That night in the Rains' house, their mother sat at the kitchen table with a glass of whiskey, her hands trembling as she tried to light a candle. Upstairs, Isolde hummed softly to herself. The melody was an old one, the same lullaby they had known since infancy. But now it was fuller, richer, and in its weaving tones 2 voices remained perfectly matched, though one of them no longer had a body to call its own. After Ilara's burial, the village expected Isolde to fade into the background, a quiet, grief-stricken child left in the shadow of loss. Instead, she seemed to grow taller in presence, her movements more deliberate, her voice carrying farther than before. It was no longer the matched harmony of 2 living girls. It was one voice, shifting at will between her own and the exact, undiluted tone of her dead sister. Sometimes she used them separately. Other times she let them blend until it became impossible to know where one ended and the other began. The effect was deeply unsettling, and those who heard it in the street would often cross to the other side rather than pass her directly. A month after the funeral, a wealthy widow from the next town visited the village. She had heard of the Rains girl's strange gift and saw in it an opportunity. She invited Isolde to live with her in her large, creaking house by the sea, offering her parents money they could not refuse. The widow introduced Isolde to her circle of acquaintances as a prodigy, someone who could channel the voices of the dead. At private gatherings, guests would sit in a dim parlor as Isolde closed her eyes and began to speak. First came her own voice, calm and clear. Then, without any change in breath or expression, she would slip into the voice of a long-dead husband, a lost child, or a parent mourned for decades. The accuracy was so exact that guests would weep openly, swearing they could feel the presence of their loved ones in the room. No one questioned how she knew the private phrases she sometimes used, words that had belonged only to the dead. And no one asked why the sessions left her looking sharper, more alive, her eyes glinting with a brightness that bordered on hunger. The widow merely smiled and encouraged her to rest, though rest was not what Isolde sought when the night came. In the attic of the widow's house, behind a locked door, was a narrow space that smelled faintly of salt and metal. Here, Isolde kept her growing collection, rows of jars resting on uneven shelves, each labeled in her careful handwriting. They held not only the remains of the village children, but new acquisitions, taken from voices she had channeled and then harvested quietly in the days or weeks after the séance. It was a private ritual, one the widow never saw, though she likely suspected something. In public, Isolde was the picture of control, polite, poised, never revealing the mechanics of her performances. But behind the calm exterior, her purpose had crystallized. The stolen voices were not simply trophies. They were sustenance. Pieces of life preserved in brine and glass, each one extending the reach of her own. In the still hours of the night, she would sit among them, speaking each name aloud in the voice it had once belonged to. Her words echoing softly against the walls, weaving a chorus that only she would ever hear in full. The widow's mansion was a place of echoing halls and locked doors, the kind of house where secrets could live for decades without being disturbed. Most of the servants had learned quickly which rooms were safe to enter and which were not, but curiosity has a way of slipping through even the narrowest cracks. It was a young maid, newly hired and unfamiliar with the unspoken rules, who first noticed the door at the far end of the basement corridor. A heavy, warped plank door with a rusted padlock. It stood apart from the rest of the cellar, its frame sunken into the stone as though it had always been part of the house. One evening, while carrying firewood down to the lower level, the maid found the door ajar. She hesitated, the faint smell of brine and something sweeter, almost metallic, drifting toward her. Pushing it open, she stepped into the dim space beyond and froze. The room was small, the walls lined with shelves bowing under the weight of countless glass jars. Each jar was filled with cloudy liquid, and in each floated a pale, shriveled structure that she did not immediately recognize. Leaning closer, she saw the delicate folds, the fine threads of muscle and tissue. She drew in a sharp breath. They were vocal cords, dozens of them. Some bore signs of age, the tissue darkened and curling inward. Others were fresh, their pale hue still holding the faint blush of life. At the center of the room sat a single bell jar, larger than the rest, its contents carefully arranged. Inside, bound with a faded ribbon of blue cotton, were the preserved vocal cords of a child. Resting beneath the jar was a strip of fabric embroidered with two perfect circles stitched in white thread. The maid's knees weakened as she realized what she was looking at. Ilara's voice, suspended forever in brine. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut before she could take a second step. From the shadows near the far wall, Isolde emerged, her face calm, her eyes sharp. There was no fear in her expression, no rush to explain. She simply stood between the maid and the door, the dim lamplight catching in her hair. When she finally spoke, it was in two voices at once, her own and Ilara's, the sound so perfectly fused it seemed to vibrate in the stone walls. The maid backed away, her hands trembling. What happened after that night was never spoken of openly. The maid vanished from the household within days, her departure explained as a sudden family emergency. But those who had worked in the mansion long enough noticed that Isolde's performances grew richer in the weeks that followed, her voice carrying new depths and tones that had not been there before. In the locked cellar, the shelves sagged just a little more under the weight of her growing collection. In the spring of 1921, Isolde received an invitation unlike any she had before. It came from a private gentleman's club in London, a place known for hosting the strange and the rare, performances whispered about rather than advertised. The widow, now frail and reclusive, encouraged her to accept, calling it the perfect stage for her most extraordinary gift. Isolde traveled alone, carrying only a single trunk and a small locked case she kept always within reach. The performance hall was dim, its audience seated in a perfect semicircle around a low, candlelit stage. No introductions were given. Isolde stepped into the light in a black gown, her hair pulled back, her posture as still and deliberate as ever. She began with her own voice, speaking a simple greeting that carried to every corner of the room. Then, without pause, she shifted into another. The voice of an elderly man, quavering but warm. Gasps broke from the audience. She moved effortlessly from one voice to the next. A young woman's laughter, a child's bright chatter, a sailor's deep timbre. Each was exact, flawless, the transition so smooth it was as though the people themselves had stepped forward to speak. Some in the crowd wept openly. Others sat rigid, their eyes fixed on her mouth as if trying to catch the trick. But there was no trick. Each voice she gave them had once been alive, had once drawn breath, and now belonged to her. She reached the finale slowly, letting the room steep in the wonder and unease her gift always inspired. For the last voice, she chose the one most precious to her, Ilara's. It rang out strong and steady, untouched by time, filling the space with a brightness no grave could dim. The applause never came. Instead, silence pressed down on the room, heavy and unbroken. Isolde stood motionless for a breath, then two, before her body began to sway. A thin trickle of blood slid from the corner of her mouth. She coughed once, sharp and sudden, and the sound was wrong. Not a voice, but the wet rasp of something, tearing inside. She fell to her knees, one hand at her throat, the other clutching the small locked case. By the time anyone reached her, she was already gone. In the chaos that followed, a doctor pried open her mouth and found something lodged deep in her throat. A braided cord of tissue, pale and slick, its fibers interwoven in a way that made it impossible to tell where one set of vocal cords ended and another began. It was as if her body had tried to hold too many voices at once, and they had finally turned inward, binding together until nothing could pass. The case she had clutched remained locked that night. When it was finally forced open days later, it was empty, as if whatever she had carried so carefully had vanished with her. After Isolde's body was taken from the club, her belongings were sent back to the widow's mansion. The widow, too frail to sort through them herself, instructed the housekeeper to place everything in the attic until she could decide what to do. For weeks, the trunk and the locked case sat untouched, gathering a thin layer of dust. It was only after the widow's death later that year that the executor of her estate, a distant cousin, began the task of clearing the house. In the bottom of Isolde's trunk, beneath neatly folded dresses and a bundle of stage programs, they found a small leather-bound book sealed shut with 2 loops of twine. The first pages were blank, but deeper inside, cramped handwriting filled every line. It was dated and signed, Isolde Raines. What began as a diary quickly became something else entirely. She wrote of her earliest memories, not of her parents or the sea, but of the pull she felt in her throat whenever someone near her spoke. She described it as a current, invisible yet irresistible, that drew their voice toward her. As a child, she had thought everyone felt it. By the age of 8, she knew they did not. She wrote of the first time she tried to keep a voice, Peter Whitlock's, and of the realization that the living sound faded too quickly unless she preserved the chords themselves. The jars, the brine, the ritual objects placed in the empty spaces of her victims, each was deliberate, each meant to bind the essence of the voice to her own. She claimed the voice was more than sound. It carried memory, emotion, even fragments of thought. To lose it was to lose the person twice. To keep it was to keep them forever. The pages covering Alara's death were written in a steadier hand, almost detached. Isolde insisted she had not killed her sister out of cruelty. She wrote that Alara had been half of one voice and that the separation had been killing them both. Absorbing her completely, she said, was an act of preservation, the only way to keep her alive. "I did not end her," she wrote. "I ended the distance between us." The final entries hinted at her later performances, each voice in her repertoire catalogued by date of acquisition. She admitted to practicing alone at night, speaking every voice in turn until they blended into a chorus only she could understand. The last line in the book read, "A voice without a body is eternal." The diary was quietly removed from the estate records. The cousin claimed it was lost in transit, but rumors spread among the servants that it had been sold to a collector who specialized in unusual artifacts. Its existence was never acknowledged publicly. Without it, there was nothing to prove the strange truth of Isolde Raines. Only whispers, a handful of blurred photographs, and the memory of a voice that could speak in tones no living throat should ever hold. The mansion stood empty for decades after the widow's death. Its windows shuttered, its gardens left to rot beneath creeping ivy. The villagers avoided it, claiming the air around it carried a faint hum. like the memory of a voice too far away to make out. It wasn't until the late 1950s, when the land was sold to a developer, that the house was finally torn down. The workers who dismantled it swore the cellar was the coldest place they had ever stood, colder even than the winter air outside. One man claimed that when his crowbar pried loose the shelving, he heard a chorus of faint sounds. Children laughing, men whispering, women singing in languages he did not understand. Another worker, visibly shaken, said he'd heard two girls speaking in perfect unison from somewhere deep in the rubble, even though the building had already been gutted. In the years that followed, the site was paved over and turned into a row of modest houses. No official record of Isolde's crimes was ever made public, though locals kept the stories alive, passing them quietly from one generation to the next. The tale was always the same: a girl with two voices, one her own and one taken from her twin, who learned to harvest the breath of others and keep their sound forever. Out of respect, or perhaps out of fear, the village council commissioned a small stone monument on the edge of the tidal flats. It bore no names, only an inscription: "For the voices the sea will not return." Few visited it in daylight, but sometimes at high tide under a full moon, someone would claim to hear a girl's voice drifting over the water. Always the same voice, sometimes young, sometimes older, but always joined by another in perfect harmony. The story left a quiet mark on the region. Burial laws were altered to require that children's coffins be sealed, and physicians were instructed to report any tampering with the throat or vocal cords in the deceased. None of these changes mentioned the rain's name, but everyone knew why they existed. It was a silent acknowledgement that something like Isolde's work had happened, and could happen again. For those who study such cases, Isolde Raines remains a phantom, her existence caught between fact and legend. No photographs survive that can be confirmed, and the diary, if it still exists, has never surfaced. What remains are the stories and the unease they leave behind. Because if what she believed was true, then somewhere in some darkened cellar or attic there may still be jars of preserved voices, their owners long dead, but their sound waiting to be called forth again. And perhaps that is the most disturbing truth, that evil does not need to shout to survive. It can live quietly behind locked doors, wearing the voice of someone you trust. What do you think? Could this happen again?